Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, wherever in the country you're joining from. This is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, process for federal grant applicants webinar and office hours. And if we could advance the next slide, please. My name is Lana Lau. I'm a Supervisory Environmental Protection Specialist at FRA in the Office of Railroad Policy and Development. I lead the NEPA policy team. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to be providing you with a high-level overview of the NEPA process and provide you with some practical strategies to help you navigate FRA's project development and environmental review process. By the end of the webinar, you should know what NEPA is and why it's required at FRA, as well as the types of environmental review documents that we prepare here. We'll also talk through categorical exclusions, also known as CEs or CADXs, which are the most commonly prepared type of document at FRA. You'll be receiving what is a condensed version of NEPA and environmental procedures today. There are, of course, entire courses that are dedicated to this topic, NEPA and transportation decision-making. We'll be discussing different environmental considerations you should have when applying for a federal grant. And at the end, we should have plenty of time to address any questions that you may have. Next slide, please. And so I hope by the end of today's office hours, you have a clear understanding of what NEPA is and why it's required. And hopefully you should be better prepared to complete a competitive grant application and be able to navigate the NEPA process when you apply for a grant. Of course, we have subject matter experts who are available to answer your questions once you get further into the process. I will be referring to the Notice of Funding Opportunity Availability, or NOFO, throughout the presentation. And so if you haven't already, I really encourage you to read that NOFO carefully. A lot of the information that you will need is provided there. It can be found on FRA's website or on grants.gov. And next slide, please. So let's talk about what NEPA is and why it's required. Next slide, please. NEPA was signed into federal law on January 1st, 1970. Actually, it was passed in 1969, but signed into law by President Nixon on January 1st, 1970. It establishes a national environmental policy and provides a framework for our environmental planning and decision-making done by federal agencies. It's a procedural statute, which means that what's important is that we follow a process, a clearly outlined process. It doesn't actually dictate the decision-making that's made at the end of that process. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, also established the CEQ, which is the Council on Environmental Quality, that provides us with our regulations for how to comply with NEPA. And the requirements of NEPA apply to all federal agencies and their actions. And we'll talk a little bit more about what an action is. Next slide, please. Frequently, private individuals or companies will become involved in the NEPA process when they need a permit that's issued by a federal agency or if they receive federal funding. So when a company applies for a permit, for example, for a crossing, when you're crossing federal lands or perhaps impacting waters of the United States, the agency that is being asked to issue the permit has to evaluate the environmental effects of the permit decision under NEPA. Federal agencies might require that the private company or a developer pay for the preparation of analyses, but the agency ultimately, and in this case FRA, is responsible for the scope and accuracy of the analysis. And as federal agencies, we are directed through the National Environmental Policy Act to avoid, minimize, or mitigate for any environmental impacts that are identified. Next slide, please. At FRA, our actions are broad and include both funding decisions. And so if you apply for a grant and receive grant funding, that is a funding decision on our part. We also issue regulations, such as on railroad safety, on horn noise, and we also approve new technology. Other federal agency actions could include, for example, from other agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers providing a permit. So if you are required to obtain a Section 404 permit from the Army Corps of Engineers or a bridge permit from the Coast Guard, that would also require the preparation of environmental documentation under NEPA. Next slide, please. We tend to conceptualize NEPA as an umbrella process. So it isn't just the National Environmental Policy Act itself, but a whole slew of other environmental statutes and regulations, some of which are listed here, and some of them are regulations, some of them are executive orders, but it's an umbrella that covers dozens of different types of requirements under the umbrella of environmental impacts. Next slide, please. And CEQ, the Council for Environmental Quality, that was established under NEPA, also established NEPA regulations that apply to all federal agencies. And those regulations are available at 40 CFR 1500 or beginning at 40 CFR 1500. And it requires all federal agencies to assess the environmental effects of a proposed action prior to making a final decision. Since 2018, FRA has shared environmental regulations with Federal Highway Administration and with the Federal Transit Administration as well. And you can find those, what we call our NEPA implementing regulations at 23 CFR 771. Next slide, please. So next we'll go into a little bit more detail on the different types of NEPA documents that are used by FRA. Next slide, please. We call these different classes of action, and the different classes of action are determined by the significance of the impacts from the project. So depending on the anticipated level of impacts, that prescribes what level of NEPA documentation is required as part of the process. And so we have three types of NEPA documents that project sponsors may prepare as you're coordinating with FRA. And so categorical exclusions are typically applied to projects with that, from our experience and expertise, typically do not have significant environmental impacts. And then we have environmental assessments and environmental impact statements. And let's move on to the next slide. So as I was describing previously, the categorical exclusions, RCEs, that's the last bullet point actually, that are described at 23 CFR 771.116 are the types of actions that we know from past experience typically do not have significant environmental impacts. The next class of action, which is the second bullet point, are EAs, environmental assessments, and then finding of no significant impact, of FONSI. These are described at 23 CFR 771.119. And this is when the agency is uncertain whether the project will have significant environmental impacts. And so there needs to be further study to determine whether they can issue a FONSI, which is a statement that there are no significant impacts, or it would require then the further preparation of an environmental impact statement. And so with the first bullet, environmental impact statements and a record of decision described in 23 CFR 771.123, these are for those big projects or projects that we know will have significant environmental impacts. And this requires the most extensive and in-depth environmental review. And there is considerable public involvement required throughout the process. Even though there are public comment periods for our EAs and FONSIs, for the environmental impact statements, that a public involvement process is even stepped up further. Next slide, please. Because the majority of the projects are covered under categorical exclusions or CEs, and I would say 90% of the projects or more, it's a good idea for us to get to know FRA's CEs a little bit better. So next slide, please. Since 2018, FRA has expanded its list of CEs that are listed at 23 CFR 771 Part 116. In 2020, over 90% of our NEPA documents were categorical exclusions or were approved as categorical exclusions. So if you look at our regulations at 771.116, you will see that we have 22 categories of CEs that are listed there. And so these are, categories of actions or projects like track and tie replacements that typically do not result in significant environmental impacts. Another thing to note is that other agencies that share these regulations with us, such as FTA and FHWA, they have their categorical exclusion lists in 23 CFR 771.117 and 771.118. And so if applicable, for example, if there is sidewalk work or some utility work associated with your project, if applicable, we could also make use of the CEs from these other two agencies. Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, CEs are our most common type of NEPA document. And so here's just some examples of the types of work that could be covered under a CE. So planning and design activities that don't actually result in construction, track and tie work, minor rail additions that occur within the existing right-of-way, certain types of property acquisition, including safety equipment and rolling stock, some emergency repairs, and construction of small minor structures. And so, those things typically would not result in significant environmental impacts, and so could be potentially covered under a CE. Next slide, please. And so my recommendation is really to get to know FRA's CE worksheet that can be found online. We have a link provided here, and you'll have access to these presentation slides afterwards. We'll also be providing a lot of helpful links at the end of the webinar today. The CE worksheet and the accompanying companion guide are both online and not only lists resources for CEs, but this information can be really helpful for you in preparing any NEPA document for FRA. So it'll guide you through thinking about and documenting what is the project purpose and need. The purpose is the problem, and the need is how your proposed project would solve or fix the identified problem. So it's important for for us to know what your project is. Because many applicants don't have a basic project description, and that's really important. We'd also like you to provide a study area map, and now these are easy to acquire from online mapping tools, or you can have a plat map with an outline of the study area, and this helps us to begin to look at and think about what potential environmental resources may be within the project area and what those potential impacts may be. The CE should include a short summary of the resources, so don't worry about listing resources that are not in the vicinity of your project. So for example, if your project is located inland and is not adjacent to the coast, then you wouldn't have to list or evaluate any coastal resource impacts. And this information will help us and you to identify potential impacts to the resources from your project. Include a summary of resources and potential impacts specific to your project area. And again, you can do this by using the CE guidebook. The CE may include commitments to project design and other measures to minimize or eliminate impacts if you know this already. So please include that kind of information, and also include any attachments, either incorporating by reference where possible or providing links and so on, of any technical memoranda or reports which support the document. So you don't have to make the CE itself, hundreds of pages long if you need to refer to other reports that support that. And if your project has past environmental studies associated with that, please let us know as well, because that can also be very helpful in providing us with additional information and context about the project and what the potential environmental impacts may be. So document as much as you can in the grant application in order to inform us, and that will help us speed up the process. Next slide, please. So this slide just shows a close-up of just a portion of the CE worksheet. And you'll see that this outlines 2 resource considerations that I'll go into a little bit more detail on in the next sections. Section 106 for historic resources and Section 4F that relates to recreational resources and also wildlife refuges and historic resources. Next slide, please. And so, what should you consider when applying for a federal grant when it comes to environmental considerations? Because NEPA readiness or environmental readiness is part of the evaluation criteria for the grant applications. So next slide, please. Again, please read the NOFO carefully. It will let you know what the evaluation criteria are so that you have a better understanding of what we're looking for. Provide as much information as you know about the project already. So that includes the project description, the location, anything you know about what environmental resources, particularly protected or sensitive resources that may be in the project area, and anything you may know about the anticipated types of impacts that may result from your project. If you have engaged with your local, state, or federal resource or permit agencies and have an idea of what permits may be required, please let us know about those as well. And keep in mind that the FRA reviewers will be determining the environmental readiness based only on the information that you provide in the application. So we cannot, and I say that again, we cannot call you up and follow up with you to solicit additional information if something is not clear or missing. So, maybe err on the side of providing a little bit more detail and a little bit more information so that we have everything that we need in order to make that assessment. Next slide, please. It's helpful if you provide any information about project planning done to date. So document and describe any past or present environmental studies, what your status is, if you're in the midst of preparing an environmental study and what work remains to be done. If you have received a previously approved FRA, FTA, or FHWA NEPA document or grant proposal, definitely include that type of information as well. And again, if you have information about any permitting requirements that apply to your project, to be able to let us know. And if you've initiated discussions with any relevant resource or permitting agencies, to describe that as well. Public involvement is such an important part of the NEPA process. It's really integral to the process. And so document any past or anticipated public outreach that you have done and what the outcome of that public outreach and engagement has been. Any agency meetings that you have or intend to have where it's appropriate. Next slide, please. Consider providing us with a draft of your CE if you're at that point in your process where you have enough information to be able to prepare a draft CE. And if you're unable to complete the draft CE worksheet, then at a minimum it's helpful to identify which category of CE you feel like your project, based on its project description and our description of CEs, you think that would apply to your project. For certain projects or proposals that don't require any type of ground disturbance, for example, if you're doing training and research, we could, it's possible that we could do even more simplified CE documentation. So that's just a heads up. And if your project doesn't seem to fit clearly within a CE category, as listed in 23 CFR 771.116, just know that it might mean that you'll need to prepare an EA or an EIS. And those processes do take more time than the preparation of a CE. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the National Historic Preservation Act. So this is just one of the environmental statutes under that NEPA umbrella that I showed you early on in the presentation that looks at historic resources. This is an act that was enacted in 1966, and Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires that federal agencies consider the impacts of their actions on historic properties. So these are also known as, agency actions or agency undertakings. And the President's Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, otherwise known as the ACHP, is the federal agency that wrote the instructions for federal agencies to comply with Section 106. These regulations can be found at 36 CFR Part 800. Section 106 must be completed prior to grant obligation. And so, FRA has to have documentation that is complete before we can obligate the grant. Next slide, please. So what are historic properties? Historic properties are districts, sites, buildings, structures, and objects that may be significant in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture. Our nation's railroads date back to the early 1800s and are historically important in many ways. And so therefore, historic properties can include the railroad infrastructure, such as bridges, tunnels, culverts, passenger stations, operations buildings, as well as segments of the railroad line. Historic properties can be listed somewhere in what's called the National Register of Historic Places, or they may be eligible to be listed on that National Register. The National Register is maintained by the National Park Service and is overseen by an individual known as the keeper. It includes both historic and prehistoric properties found to be significant at a local, state, and or national level. And there are specific criteria that historic properties have to meet in order to be listed on the National Register or to be considered for listing there. These criteria were established by the National Park Service. Properties that are subject to a Section 106 review don't have to be listed currently on the National Register. As long as they meet the NPS criteria to be considered eligible, they have to be accounted for. And so this step is completed through a consultation process between FRA and the State Historic Preservation Officer or the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer if it's on tribal lands, with assistance from you, the grantee or the project sponsor. Next slide, please. And so we just have some examples of historic railroad infrastructure here. And if you are aware that you have historic structures within the project vicinity, you should definitely absolutely list these as part of the draft CE in the grant application. Even if your project qualifies for a CE under NEPA, it still may require consultation with the SHPO office. And so, assistance from a qualified consultant may be needed if you don't have the expertise in-house. So keep that in mind. And remember that the Section 106 process and consultation must be complete prior to obligation of any grant funding. Next slide, please. In 2015, Section 11504 of the FAST Act, which is the Train Act portion, mandated that the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation work with USDOT to develop an alternative method of Section 106 compliance for projects located in railroad right-of-way. On August 17th in 2018, the ACHP issued the program comment to exempt consideration of effects to rail properties within the rail rights of way. And this program comment can be used by any federal agency. Congress also directed this Section 106 exemption be consistent with the exemption for interstate highways approved by ACHP in 2005. However, there are significant dissimilarities between interstate highways and the railroads, which resulted in differences between the highway exemption and the program comment that was issued for rail right-of-way. One of the main differences is that the nation's railroads have a much longer and varied history than the interstate highway system. And as a result, a wide variety of repair, maintenance, and upgrade activities are exempted from Section 106 review under the program comment for rail right-of-way. However, entire rail lines and the nation's rail network are not exempt like highways. And so the program comment is comprised of two parts. We have an activities-based approach that focuses on activities with effects to historic rail properties that are foreseeable and minimum or not adverse. And we have those lists of exempted properties. And then we also have a property-based approach. Next slide, please. And so here, talking a little bit more about those exempted lists of activities that's available under Appendix A, we have a total of 95 different exempted activities and 13 different activity types that are listed here. These exempted activities generally apply to the maintenance, repair, and upgrade of existing rail properties, which is necessary to ensure the safe and efficient operation of rail operations. It's a list of routine activities that are known to have minimum or no adverse effects on historic properties if they are present. And some examples of projects that are not exempt from Section 106 review would include demolition or replacement of railroad bridges and building new stations or rail lines. So when an exempted activity covers one or more activities within a project scope of work, it provides a shortcut to completing a Section 106 review. And in that case, usually the review can be completed in less than 30 days. Next slide, please. Section 4F of the USDOT Act of 1966, this is a statute that applies only to USDOT funded or permitted projects. And the intent of the statute is to protect publicly owned parks, recreational facilities, wildlife refuges, as well as certain historic properties. And you'll find the regulations in 23 CFR Part 774. And so if there are properties protected under Section 4F within your project area, please include that information as part of your draft CE in the grant application process. And unlike the NEPA process itself or the NEPA statute, which is a procedural statute, as I discussed earlier, that just requires you to follow certain procedural steps and doesn't dictate the decision one way or another. Section 4F is a substantive statute that requires you to, if at all possible, avoid impacting Section 4F properties. And so, avoidance is the first thing to be done. And if that is not achievable, then you're directed to minimize those impacts in any way practicable. Next slide, please. And so here we'll talk about some resources that are available for you at FRA for going through the NEPA process. And I'm not going to read all of these in detail. Next slide, please. But please refer back to these and click on the links and look at the information that's available. We have our FRA NEPA procedures. And as I already talked about before, we have a categorical exclusion worksheet that you should definitely familiarize yourself with to understand the types of information that we're looking for, as well as the CE companion guide that provides a little bit additional context and description to help you understand the type of information, how to fill out that CE worksheet. We also have the USDOT has NEPA resources, and that link will provide you with a lot of additional resources that are provided by USDOT. Next slide, please. The Council on Environmental Quality website also has a lot of information about NEPA and the related requirements. And for a quick and dirty guide to understanding the NEPA process, there is the Citizens Guide to NEPA. The AASHTO Center for Environmental Excellence also has a really great series of practitioners' handbooks that talks about different aspects of the NEPA process. So if you have questions about purpose and need or what different reasonable alternatives and how to do environmental impact analysis, those are excellent handbooks to refer to or to refer your consultants to. Next slide, please. Regarding the Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, here are a bunch of resources that you can refer to, both to the regulations themselves as well as to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation's description and walkthrough of the Section 106 process. We have a citizen's guide for the Section 106 process there as well, and some examples of infrastructure projects. And also that program comment I mentioned earlier, that's the link to that program comment down at the bottom of the page. Next slide, please. So what does this all mean? Just some key takeaways for you, since we've covered a whole lot of information. Again, please read the NOFO carefully. Remember, we can only assess your application based on the information that you've provided. So provide more environmental information than necessary, and fully describe your project, including its purpose and need and anticipated impacts. Clearly describe how your project will address climate change, environmental justice, and racial equity considerations. And if your project is selected for funding, compliance with NEPA and potentially several other environmental laws, as you saw under that NEPA umbrella, may be necessary. You may require the assistance of a qualified consultant for certain specific environmental resources, such as wetlands or the Section 106 historic resources or 4F resources or endangered species. So, just be aware that you may need to pull in additional expertise as well. Next slide. Again, make use of our categorical exclusion companion guide and our other online resources to help you complete the CE worksheet, and provide a draft CE with your application if at all possible. And to follow up, if you have questions, then please use that email contact available here on the slide, as well as any other information we have on our website with our tips to help you expedite your environmental review process. And just know that FRA will verify and approve all the NEPA information and documentation after we meet after the grant is awarded.